I'm going to make a simple sewing frame for bookbinding out of a shoebox and a piece of dowel. This is 1/4 inch dowel that's like an inch longer on each end than my shoebox. Now this is not a great substitute for a sewing frame, but it will work. So the first thing we want to do is, if you have a shoebox like I do, you need to cut and separate the lid from the box. So now that I've removed the lid, I've drawn in 1.5 inches on the 2 short sides and 1.5 inches on one of the long sides, and I cut on those 3 lines, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And now I can release that panel, so I have this kind of situation. Now I'm going to leave this for now. If I find that it gets in my way, I can always trim it off. And then my last step is to tape this dowel across the top here, going side to side, and this will give us a nice sturdy straight piece to anchor our tapes to. And now I have a simple sewing frame that I can use for sewing on tapes. Now I'm going to make 2 guides for laying out the tapes, and I just have here a piece of white cardstock that is 4 inches by 11 inches, and I have it aligned on my craft mat. I'm just going to start with a line that is about 3.5 inches from the left, and this will just help center these on my paper. And then from there I'm going to come over 1/2 inch, and I'm just going to write the word tape twice on here so that I remember that's where a tape is going to go. Then I'm going to move over 7/8 of an inch, 7/8 of an inch, and then from there another 1/2 inch, and again I'll write tape there, and I'll repeat that, 7/8 of an inch, and then 1/2 inch, and finally I'll write tape in both of those places. And I'll just write left over here so I remember which way the papers go. So now I'm just going to take this to my paper trimmer and cut it in half down the middle so that I have 2 strips that are 2 inches wide. So now I have my 2 strips, and I'm just going to take some adhesive and run a couple of lines down it, and I'm going to put one on the top of my shoebox and get it straight on there, straight. And then I'll take this other one and put it on the bottom of my shoebox, but I'll make sure that I get them aligned so that these lines for this tape match up with the lines for this tape. So I cut some pieces of twill tape. This is my 1/2 inch wide twill tape, and so that this piece is about 4 inches longer on each end than the width of my box, or you could think about it 8 inches longer than the width of the box. And I'm going to put half of it on the bottom and half of it on the top. And to do that, I've just put some temporary adhesive on the back of the tape. And this isn't critical that it's exactly 4 inches. You want to have about that. And now just put a little tension on there, not a lot, just so it stays snug. And then go ahead and attach it to the other side, and do that for the other 2 tapes as well. Now my tapes are on there pretty securely just with that temporary adhesive. If you feel like they need something else, you could run a piece of low-tack tape across the top or the bottom if you want. And I should also say that my tape came out of a package, and I did take a minute to iron it flat so that I wouldn't have any bends in the tape. So now I have my sewing frame prepared. So normally to sew, we would have the box sitting on our table and these tapes would be in the vertical position. But in order for me to show you how to sew, I've clamped it to this box so I can hold it in this position and work. But know that normally this is the vertical position and you would have this sitting on the edge of your table. So here I have my stack of pages, and I'm going to start with the back page. So this is my back page, and this is my top over here to my left, so I'm just checking to make sure I have that oriented correctly. There's my T, I see it. So you would feed this in, and it would sit on the bottom. And how this is going to work, you should be able to see the holes here when you do it, is that we're basically just going to take our thread in and out, and we'll go in on the bottom hole, run along the inside, come out and go around the tape, then go back to the inside, come up, come out, go around the tape, go back to the inside, come up again, go around the tape on the outside, go back in, and finally come out on this top hole. So I've threaded my bookbinding needle with a length of wax linen thread, and in the notes you'll see how much I ended up using. But if that amount seems like too much for you to deal with, you can always use shorter pieces and join them with a bookbinder's knot. So I'm going to start by going inside on this bottom hole here and then coming back out on the next one. And when you do that, make sure that you're always pulling your needle and thread in the direction that you're working. So I've left about a 6-inch tail here, and I've come up in the inside, and here you can see I'm just about ready to go over the tape and go back to the inside. So I'm going to thread that all the way up, and I'll come back when I've come out at this end. So I've come out on the last hole, and now I'm going to pull in the direction that I was going, which is to the left here, and make sure that all of my loops are snug, both on the inside and the outside. You don't want to over tighten. And you can do this as you go along, of course. I just find it easier, and perhaps it's because I'm working in this kind of odd position, to be able to have a little slack as I'm working and then go back and tighten them. And then I'll check on the inside as well and make sure that there's no loose thread on the inside. Now I want to have about an 1/8 of an inch spacing between my pages, so I'm just taking my spine piece and my end piece that I've already cut, and I'm just going to use some temporary adhesive and put them together. And those two pieces of medium weight chipboard will give me about an 1/8 of an inch spacer that I can use in between my pages. So I'm going to take my 1/8 inch spacer and hold it right up against the page we already inserted, and then I'll get one of my watercolor pages and I'll check where my little T is to make sure that I keep my tops always oriented to my left, and then I'll put that in line here. And what I'm going to do is take this thread up from the bottom one and go into the first hole on the watercolor paper, go into through the inside, come back out, go over the tape, etc. all the way down, using this spacer to on the front end here to make sure that we keep the right distance in between the two pages. So I'll do that and then I'll be back. And one thing I want to emphasize as you're doing your sewing is make sure you do not catch the tapes with your needle as you go along. So here I am, and I'm all the way down through the end of my watercolor paper, and I need to tie this off down here. So I'm going to tie a square knot using the end and the piece thread. I'll keep my spacer in place here, and square knot is just left over right and right over left. So I'll tie my square knot and I'll be back. Once I've tied my square knot, I have my I have the square knot end coming kind of down towards me, and I have her hanging down off the edge of the table if you were working properly. And then this is my end with the needle ready to go. So I've just moved my spacer up on top of that piece of watercolor paper, and I'm going to add another piece of watercolor paper, again checking to make sure that I have my top oriented correctly, and then I'll just put it in place, going out and in until I get up to this hole. So I'll do that and then I'll be back. So now that I'm at the end of this page, I need to hook it into the page below. And we're going to do that using something called the kettle stitch. Now I'm going to just move the spacer out of the way for a moment. And we'll put that spacer back in here before we tighten the kettle stitch up. But what we want to do is count down 1 from where we just came out and put the needle behind that stitch. So I'm taking the needle in like this and sticking it behind there. And then I'm going to take my working thread here and loop it behind the end of that needle. And then bring it here in the front. And before I tighten this up, I'll slide my spacer back in place. So now I have my spacer in place. And I've zoomed in, so hopefully you can see what's going on here. That thread is behind the needle, and then I'll just pull that through and tighten it up, pulling up. And there's our kettle stitch, and we're all ready to add our next piece on and work back down here to the right. So I'll shift my spacer and add my third piece of watercolor paper. Now I've worked my way all the way back to the right end, and I'll kettle on this side. This time I put the needle in. We always make the needle going out towards the edge. Again, it's going, I came down to the stitching below the last signature that we had. So you count down 2. And then put the needle out, coming out, and then take your working thread, loop it around the needle, and keeping your spacer in there, draw that tight. So that was 3 pieces of watercolor paper. So now we're ready to add the center black cardstock piece. I'll again shift my spacer, put that in place, and then take my center page, make sure that I have the top aligned correctly, and get that in place ready to sew. So you recall that in the center piece we have 2 rows of stitching holes. I'm going to go in the closest row first and then make my kettle, and then I'll be back. So I've made my kettle here on the left end, And now I'm just going to turn around, and remember this is our piece that has the 2 rows of holes. I'm going to go back down, working through the second set of holes until I get to this end. Now when we get down here to the right end, we're going to kettle like we usually do, but we should protect this so we don't tear out this inner piece here. You want to be kind of gentle with it. The other thing you could do is to take your covers from the if you've already cut them for the book, or if you haven't already cut them, just put 4 pieces of medium weight chipboard inside of that channel there, and then you've got the spacer below it, and that should help protect it. But again, just be gentle as you kettle there. So here's my kettle on this side, and I just pulled it very gently up here to the top. And now I'll switch my spacer up on top of this center black cardstock and add my 3 pieces of watercolor paper, just as we've done before. Kettling at the end of each row, of course. So I finished with one last kettle stitch here on the right. I'm leaving my thread for now, and I'm just going to take this the tape off of my sewing frame and basically release the book from the sewing frame, and then I'll be back. So here's my book off the frame, and just for a little added security, now we've done our last kettle stitch. Normally I would come back up inside of this first signature and tie this off, but because this is black, I'm going to flip to this first watercolor signature and just take my needle back through that first hole there. Make sure I don't have any slack, and then just tie this off here by slipping this under and making a knot. Now to finish our book block, we'll start by making sure that if there's any spacing in between these signatures, that we've got it pulled apart a little bit for that, and then cut the tapes on both sides to about 3 inches. You can see I've done that for this first one here. And then we'll flip that tape open and put score tape on the back, but keep it about 1/8 of an inch shy of where the tape meets the page. And do that on both the front and the back. And then once we have our score tape on, we can just put these in place. You can measure to keep them straight, or just eyeball it and put those 3 down. So I attached my 3 tapes to one side, and before I attach these to the other side, we want to make sure that we've allowed enough slack in the ribbons, that we just don't pull these tight over here to this side. So I've marked kind of a landing zone for my tapes to come, and then I'm going to stand it up here on the end, and what I'm looking for is to have the tapes, the visible part of the tapes here on the end, be about 1 3/8 inches. So it's 1 3/8 inches from the front to the back. And hopefully it won't be any less than 1 3/8 inches. If you can give it a little stretch out, go ahead and do that. But I'll put one down, the bottom one down, and then I'll come and measure and put the top one down, again 1 3/8 inches. Put this top one down, and then finally I'll measure and put the middle one down. Now I've attached the tapes down on both of my page A's, and then I also have here cut 2 pieces that are called the backing for page A. They're cut the exact same size here, and you can see I've prepped them with some score tape. I used inch wide on the long vertical sides because I'm going to do some corner rounding on the outside edges, and I want to make sure I have good adhesion here. and then of course good adhesion on the back. So I've prepped some on the other side of these tapes as well, and then I'll just line up my pages and match the corners exactly here. Now I find this easier to do if I open it up in a flat position here, and then I can more easily line everything up. Then once that's down, I'll of course give it a good burnish. And then I'll round these outside edges. I have this is a corner chomper, but you can use any 1/2 inch corner rounder. And the reason we're doing this is this book block is meant to be removable from the covers, so that if you want to work on it more easily, you can pull it out and just play with it however you want. And finally, for our last step, I just want to create just the barest crease here that's about 1/8 of an inch away from where our stitching is. And it's thick, so it's a little bit tricky to do, but I'm going to start out by just lining up the end and then scoring and trying to score it 3 7/8 and following that along. Now you might have to jump up when you hit the tape. It won't score over the tape, so just move along and then come back and get the rest of that. And repeat that on the other side. And then if you have a sharp edge on your table, you can use that, or I have this box that I like to use that I know has a real sharp edge, and I can just line that score that we just made up on that thing, on that sharp edge there, and kind of bend it around, and that will just give us a little bit of give for that first and last page of the book. And it'll take a minute to work on this, and you can take your bone folder, hold it on one side and come up here on the top and use your bone folder on that. Just something, it doesn't have to be a perfect crease, just something that kind of gives it a little bit of give right there, and do that on both the front and the back. So I've zoomed in here, so hopefully you can see this little slant that's going on each side. That's where that 1/8 inch that I just did is. And like I said, it's not a perfect 90-degree angle, but it doesn't need to be, just something with a little bit of give there. So now we have our structure for our book block completed, and we're ready to add some decorative elements.